So, history of yoga. So open up your manuals to your handout. Now, I want to treat this lecture like a fireside chat. So it'll be the first section in your history and philosophy, I think. This is kind of like gathering around the fire, storytelling, learning some stuff. Don't worry too much about capturing like every little bit of information. There's a lot of information in here that you can go back to. So there's like all of your, like there's lots of notes in there. So don't worry, you're not going to miss anything important. So you can kind of let it wash over you like a story. I know, there's tons of information. So, yes, so delightful. Got it? Okay, good. So we'll cast our imaginary fire here. So yoga, the history of yoga, this is one of the most incredibly diverse and wonderful spiritual offerings that came out of India. So for thousands of years, India has been a site of continuous exploration and inquiry and development of different techniques. And what's so wonderful about what we're doing now is that we are part of the living tradition of yoga. So by understanding the roots of yoga and where it came from, we can make mindful decisions as both practitioners and teachers about how we want to carry this tradition forward. Like what is really the heart of the practice, the essence of the practice, and how do you want to continue being part of this tradition as we continue to practice and then also teach other people. So it's super fun. So we're going to go through all these different ages of yoga basically, and find out kind of what the major ideas and the importance was of each. So let's just start with this. Why do you think yoga started?
Medicine, to cure people.
To cure people of what?
Ailment.
Right. Yes. And there were definitely parts of yoga which are the seeds of Ayurveda. So if anyone's heard of Ayurveda, that's like the medicinal healing properties. But let's even go back. We're even going to go back further. Like or make a bigger picture. Why do any philosophies, or dare we say religions? Well, I don't know, I'll open that can of worms. But why do any philosophies begin?
To make sense of the world.
To make sense of the world.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say to pass on knowledge as well, and to obtain a structure of living.
Obtain a structure of living, yeah. Right? So it's like, how do I navigate this world? Exactly. And how do I pass that on to figure out, what were you saying? Why am I?
What did I say? To make sense of things.
To make sense of things. So what happens to humans? What happens to us? Like if we were just happy all the time, would we have invented yoga?
Well, no, we want to connect to source. We want to know if there's something bigger than me. When I look at
Self-study.
the sky, I'm like, I clearly didn't create it. How did it get there? But then all of a sudden I discover that I am God. Because we all, right?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
Self-study.
Self-study. Yeah.
Like learning more about yourself and what you're in.
Yeah. So we have this quest, like humans. Hello. Why are we here? Why do we suffer? How can I live a better life? How did all of this happen? How do I live a good life? How do I pass these things on to other people? Like, what's the purpose? And so yoga comes from is a set of whole philosophies. It's like this vast web of philosophies, which are all kind of looking to answer these fundamental questions of what it is to be human. Like, why do I suffer? How can it stop? Why am I here? What's my purpose? let's get right to that. Do you guys relate to these questions?
Like a 3-year-old, why?
Why? Yeah. So philosophy can be described as a particular system of principles for the conduct of life or a system of beliefs. And it grows out of a quest to find purpose, meaning, and happiness in how we live. So how old do you think yoga is? Everyone, you can take a guess.
5,000 years.
5,000 years. That's really good. Any other estimates? Everyone's like behind the 5,000.
Oh yeah? Oh,
6,000.
6. She's gonna give it a 6. Okay. So here, nobody really knows. Okay. So, but and it depends kind of who you ask, because different scholars will trace it back to different points of origin. So if we're tracing yoga back to the Vedas, and we'll talk about what the Vedas are, then we're looking at like 5,000-6,000 years old. Some scholars trace it back that far. Others trace it back just simply to the Upanishads, which are considered part of the Vedas. But those were written about 3,000 years ago, because that's where we see really the origin of certain kinds of thoughts that we really equate to yoga today, like meditation. And we're like, that's kind of where this system of yoga started. But either way, it's really old. So it's at least 3,000 years old. And what's really cool about India is that the culture of India is one of assimilation rather than kind of taking over in general. So when different philosophical ideas would come in over the course of its vast history, instead of an invasive idea coming over and wiping out the previous set of ideas, they were like, oh, that's interesting. And so instead there's this kind of discourse and an evolution of ideas and sort of debating ideas back and forth or assimilating new ideas into current trains of thought. So as a result, there's this sort of unbroken continuum of discourse that's gone on for thousands of years, which is why it is such a rich hotbed or cauldron of philosophical thought. And so yoga itself has developed many, many different branches. So when we say yoga, it can mean so many different things. So it's right to be a little bit like, what the heck is it? Because it actually has so many different pieces to it. But really, the entire goal of all of these different philosophies is the liberation from suffering and the identity of who we truly are. Like to find, who are we really? That's kind of the goal of yoga. And one thing that I think is useful to consider too, and these are how we kind of break down, and keep in mind that these are artificial constructs. Like yoga is just it's like a big bushy tree, crazy. And so we're kind of artificially breaking it down into these separate ages so that we can sort of parse apart and look at the major ideas and what was going on and have some semblance of sanity around trying to categorize all these different things. But it's useful to remember that our branch of yoga, it's kind of like the history of yoga is a big tree. So, and we're going to go back to the roots of yoga, the beginning of the tree. And we're going to trace as it grows up. But as we trace part of it, remember that we're only tracing one branch. And all these other kind of systems of thought, because India has a lot of different systems of philosophy, all of those other philosophies are also continuing to grow to create this kind of a crazy wild tree. So our yoga, Western yoga, asana practice is kind of out here on the end of a branch right now. But there's this whole tree all springing from the same roots. So these other things that we talk about, like when we talk about the Vedas, it's not like all of a sudden people stop dealing with the Vedas. No, that continues on. It's just that we're going to trace our particular tree branch all the way out to where we are here today. So big bushy tree. All right. So let's dive in. So our story begins a long time ago in this particular galaxy, with the Indus Valley civilization. Has anyone heard of the Indus Valley civilization? Yeah, so the I didn't have neither. So the Indus Valley civilization is one of the oldest civilizations. So if we think back to the agricultural revolution, so when people stopped being hunter-gatherers and started settling down, they would settle down near rivers, because they would start to grow things and you need a consistent source of water. And so these early civilizations would crop up around rivers, and so that is like the Indus Valley. And I'll show you a picture of it in just a second. And so in this transition, it was like people stopped roaming free. And once you start settling in one place, that begins to create consistencies in ideas. It starts to create trade with other places. People start to be able to store granaries or store grain and store things like that over seasons. So there starts to be other kinds of, basically jobs developed. You're not just out there hunting for food all the time. Then you have the beginning of trade and craftsmanship and all of these other things that are required. Yeah, Liz.
Because
yes,
people had free time. They had more free time than when they were hunter-gatherers, which was all about day-to-day survival. And so I think, for me, thinking about civilization and sort of one of the big pivot points of, as we know, modern civilization, is people had more free time to develop and ask these questions and make sense of things and try to make sense of things. So.
Yeah, because when you're not having to survive, then there's space to do that.
And create.
Yeah. Why are we so busy then? Shouldn't we have so much free time? Oh my gosh. Okay, that's a debate for another time. All right. Okay, so anyways, we had this transition to actually like urban centers and people coming together. So here's a picture. That's India, and you can see northwest India and Pakistan is where these early civilizations were. Mehrgarh was the oldest one. That was like 9,000 years ago, okay? And it had 20,000 people in it. Can you imagine? This early civilization, 20,000 people, that just blows my mind. I'm not sure how they knew that, but they cultivated cotton, pottery, and they had trade. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are later civilizations, but they're better recorded, like the ruins are quite nice, and they were excavated, I think, in the 20s. Let's say that these centers were believed to have trade, urban centers, and maybe even early writing. So here's a picture of Mohenjo-Daro. And this is the best documented city in the Indus Valley. And this kind of hit its peak around, let's say, 4,000 years ago or so. I know, right? Nuts.
Is there any proof or documentation that the fact that it became like 20,000 people in this community, was there a leader that they followed?
That I do not know.
Because that makes me curious, because usually there's someone,
Who's in charge?
yeah,
Well,
or revered in some way,
Yeah.
that causes a gathering, which then creates a community, which creates stability, growth, and all of these things. But there is one.
I don't know. We should find out.
I know,
We'll
but
find
I'm
out.
actually really curious.
So what's interesting about these centers is that there were these little seals, these little soapstone seals, which have little pictographs, which we haven't been able to decipher. But if you look at that, like some people look back at that and say, hey, clearly that's yoga, that's meditation. My philosophy teacher's like, it's a dude sitting, like how many ways can you sit? Like, you know, so it's like, what we tend to, and this kind of brings up a cautionary tale for us as we look back at yoga and the yoga history, is that we're going to tend to superimpose our own ideas about what we think yoga is back on these early things, when in fact, we don't know. It's kind of hard to just clear our minds and see this from the beginning. But basically, we got a dude sitting down. Is he meditating? I don't know. There's some critters around. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not.
T-Rex.
The T-Rex, they got a little T-Rex. It looks like a little T-Rex, doesn't it?
Could be a giant rat.
Could be a giant, it's a,
Yeah. Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
all right. So the Vedic Age, at this time, the Vedas began to be composed. So the Vedas were hymns, and they grew in complexity. So over a period of time, they were channeled wisdom. So that's called Shruti. You know, channeled insight, where it wasn't the person actually creating it. It was like they were being a channel for this wisdom to come through. And then these hymns were developed. Now, Veda means knowledge, from the root vid, which means to know or to see. And so they weren't written, of course, at this time. This little boy is reading a book, reading the Vedas. But keep in mind, these were all orally transmitted, really until the Middle Ages. Like, things just weren't written down for a long time. So there are 4 books to the Vedas, and each Veda has like 4 different kinds of texts within it. Now these were mostly for priests. So over time, what happened is that when you have these early cultures, these are like shamanic cultures, the Vedic culture. So where, like, if I've got like the sunshine, I've got it raining and floods and seasons, I'm trying to grow stuff, I start praying to the sun god, Savitur. I'm like, sun god, come and like make me crops, right? So this is kind of like the early rituals in which the Vedas emerged, was a desire to keep the natural order of things going smoothly. So if I do my hymn just right, and I, you know, pronounce everything just so, then everything will work out well, and the gods will be appeased. And this is also a sacrificial culture where you burn offerings, send the smoke to the gods, they're appeased, and then everybody's happy. So yeah, like sacrifices, animal sacrifices.
Then suddenly the rain doesn't come and the sun doesn't go.
And then you gotta make another sacrifice. Yeah, we pronounced it wrong. Something happened, right? So there were fire worship, so like burning things, the idea of like burning things in order to sacrifice things. Yeah, the Upanishads even talk about a horse sacrifice. So it's like, yes, there were sacrifices. So we wanted to placate the gods. So do you guys know the Gayatri mantra? Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Tat Savitur Varenyam. So that's from the Vedas. It's back in the Vedas. Isn't that cool?
I didn't realize that was from so long
I
ago.
know. Yeah, it's actually a hymn to the sun god, Savitur. Ombor Bhuva Swaha Tat Savitur Varenyam. May we assume the brightness of the sun god. And so originally it was like literally like praying to the sun, but then over time it assumes different depths of meaning as the sun becomes a metaphor for enlightenment or consciousness, right? So, anyways, but we'll get there. So the rise of the priests, right? So with any kind of culture, like I think of the Catholic Church, it starts off as kind of this ragtag band of stuff happening. And then as it assumes more power and as there becomes like a hierarchy, things start getting more complex and more politicized. So similarly, Vedic culture became increasingly hierarchical. And in fact, this is when the caste system developed. Right? And then the priests were kind of the Brahmins, were at the highest height. And then the priests are the ones who are in charge of the rituals, and no one else is really involved in that at all, right? And so there are kind of like two different, just historically, here's a little picture of the caste system. Some say that the Vedas were brought into India by invaders from the north, and some say that the Vedas arose from the indigenous cultures that were already present. I think that it tends to be the theory that it came from invaders, but just know that there's a debate and we don't really know. Yeah. So it's a long time ago. But at any rate, by about 1900 BC, BCE, before the Common Era, these civilizations were gone. And the rivers dried up and everybody moved east to the Ganges and to other places. So this is where we kind of mark the end of the Vedic period per se, is about 4,000 years ago. Crazy, huh? Isn't that amazing? So, in other news, globally at this time, it was the Bronze Age, yay! And there were pyramids. The pyramids were built, the development of hieroglyphics. Yin and Yang theory begins to develop in China. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians developed cuneiform writing. And it's the first date on the Mayan calendar. So this is kind of just some little snapshots of where we are in history. Also, the world's population starts to rise. So as people stop being hunter-gatherers and start settling and maybe there's more food or whatever, people are able to procreate more and support maybe more children. In Greece, the beginning of the Aegean civilization, Stonehenge was built, I don't know. Something. First dynasty of China. And thank you, Egypt, the creation of unleavened bread. Okay. Amazing.
Bring on the matzah.
Bring on the matzah. So that's the Vedic civilization. So that's where our story begins, with these rituals. Primarily, again, think like a shamanic culture, a natural culture designed to keep the natural order of things going smoothly so that everybody lives and survives. So then we come into the Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads now are actually considered part of the Vedas, so you know, but they're distinct from the Vedas. They have kind of a different worldview and a different set of practices, so it's worth looking at them separately. So this time period is when the oldest Upanishads were composed or channeled, created. Upanishads also being texts which were channeled through seers. And in the Veda, or in the Upanishads, we see quite a shift a little bit in philosophy. There was a bit of a departure from the Vedas. So here was the problem. A cartwheel. No. What a cartwheel? What is this called? Ferris wheel. No, Ferris wheels weren't the problem. But this is the problem of karma. So in the Vedas, there's something implicit going on, where in the Vedas I think, okay, if I sacrifice this horse, if I sacrifice this lamb, I send the smokes to the gods, there's a cause and there's effect. There's an action and a reaction, right? And so now all of a sudden I'm on this wheel of cause and effect. I do something, there's a response to that. I'm accumulating this stuff, which is called karma, which is the residue of this cycle of cause and effect. And in fact, life is seen as this wheel of suffering going around and around and around. And since I can't possibly see all of the results of what I'm doing in this lifetime, surely I come back. There's reincarnation, then I come back, and then I have my goat again and my wife who's mad at me, and here I am in the cycle all over again, and then I die, and then I come back and I have my wife and my goat, and then everybody's like, when does it stop? And so there was a certain sect of people who were like, this is bullshit. They're like, participating in this over and over and over. This is not the way to liberate ourselves. This is a madhouse. We're in a madhouse. Why am I going to stay in this, in the Ferris wheel that will never stop? The only way to get out of this cycle of karma is to get out of society, is to stop dealing with my goat, stop dealing with my wife. I'm going to go out in the forest. I'm going to meditate. Oh, and so this is where we see
Story's getting good.
stories get good. Gonna go to the forest. And even better, they did something called Soma, which was like some, like, I imagine like hippies in the forest, like being like, dude, like everything is one, like, because that's kind of where they were at.
Somebody had a spiritual awakening somewhere.
There was spiritual awakening somewhere. So a group of people basically went to the forest. They're like, I'm not going to participate in this wheel anymore. I'm going to sit and meditate. And I'm going to meditate as a way of burning out this karma. I'm not going to take new action, and we're going to still the mind, and we're going to figure this out. And so out of that tradition, out of this kind of renunciant tradition, renouncing society, the Upanishads emerged. Upanishad means sit down near, which reflects the relationship, which reflects the relationship of the teacher to the student, of sitting down near. And this is where that idea of guru and student comes up. So where, there's stories in the Upanishads about like students coming to their guru and they're like, oh guru, will you teach me the true nature of the self? And the guru's like, go and tend my cows for 40 years. And they're like, okay. And they go away and they tend the cows and they come back and they're like, will you teach me the nature? And they give them like a tidbit. They'd be like, it's not your body. And he'd be like, will you tell me more? They'd be like, go take care of my cows for 30 years. Then go off, take care of the cows, and come back. It's like this process though of being, having studentship, right? Being open to the learnings and being willing to put in the time to be a vessel for this kind of teaching. So the Upanishads were, in a way, an internalization of the rituals of the Vedas. So the Vedas, if you remember, it's like a ritual, there's smoke, there's fire, there's offerings. Well, in a way, the Upanishads are about fire, but instead it's an internal fire. It's tapas, which is like discipline and like asceticism and no wine, no women, no wine, no women, no meat. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to meditate and that's the internal fire that I'm creating rather than something outside of myself. And the sacrifice that I am creating, like I'm going to sacrifice my ego. I'm going to sacrifice my illusions. I'm going to sacrifice my incorrect ideas about things. I'm sacrificing those things in order to discover the true self. So the primary tool of the Upanishads was meditation. And through meditation and going inside, that's where we realize I am God. I am that thing I seek. And so this is where we start seeing real specific ideas that we still relate to in yoga, which is why some scholars say, yoga really began with the Upanishads. Because this is where we see meditation and insight and some of the stuff that we still practice today, going inside to find the truth. So the Upanishads, though they are considered part of the Vedas, are in another sense a real philosophical departure from the Vedas, because they have kind of a different worldview.
The hippies of that era, kind of.
They were the hippies of that era. Without the sex.
Right.
Without the free love. That comes later in Tantra, we'll see. Yeah. No, that's exactly right, yeah. So some important ideas that we see emerging from this time is meditation, the idea of karma, samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. Prana is mentioned, and the subtle body and the layers of the body. If you've heard of the koshas, and I think you'll talk about this later in your training, but it's like the 5 sheaths of the body. So there's the physical body, and then there's like the energetic body, the mental body, the bliss body. So there's all these different layers of human experience which begin to be mapped out, which is not just interested in the outside world, but which is interested in the inner experience. We start to see that. A quote is, meditation is higher than thought. So a recognition that the chaos of the mind is not actually the truth. And that meditation is what leads us more deeply into the truth. So one of the key philosophical ideas of the Upanishads is something called non-dualism. So just to plant a seed here, as a very general guide, we can divide philosophies, spiritual philosophies, into 2 camps, dual and non-dual. Dual is where the material world and the spiritual world, in essence, are separate. So it's like we have this world, this body, this stuff, everything tangible, and that is completely separate from whatever is eternal, spiritual, consciousness, soul. Those things are different, right? Heaven and earth. Whereas in a non-dual philosophy, those things are considered to be two sides of the same coin. The physical world and like the manifestation of this world and soul and spirit can coexist together. So this is a really cute little cartoon, which I think does a good job of describing non-dualism. Because in non-dualism, it's like this separation that I see between you and me is an illusion. We're all part of the same fabric. Everything is one. So non-dual, not two, not object, but one. We're one thing, we're just confused. We just don't realize we're one thing, or we have limitations or whatever, that we can't see that. So in this thing, he's like, I am that. So I am that being God, right? Or soul or spirit or the ultimate reality, that I am part of that. And then he starts to erase. He just goes to I am, which is kind of like when you meditate and you just have pure presence. That's sort of the experience of I am. And then he erases, he's like, ta-da. And then he's like, no labels. Because if we get rid of our labels, we can't piece out the world into individual sections. If I don't know the word for you and me, or tall or short, or black or white, then all of a sudden I don't see the world as being composed of individual things. It's one thing together. Language is what makes separation, which is artificial. Useful, but artificial, right? So he even gets rid of language. And then he's like, I'm just going to get rid of that. And then he's like, I'm going to get rid of me. So he gets rid of the boundary of himself and the rest of the world until he experiences it all as one thing. And that would be non-dual, non-two, a unity. So us being all the same stuff. We are one. I am you, you are me. And it's indescribable, so it's just like, bleh. You can't even say it. Right? So there's another idea which is called neti, not this, which is like that the indescribable, like if you get rid of everything, I am not my body, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings, not this, I'm not this, I'm not this, then you're left with what is, which is indescribable. Oh my God, what time is it?
Here we go.
Big stuff.
Isn't it cool? Yeah. I know, it's amazing. So one of the Upanishads is called the Mandukya Upanishad. It's actually the shortest Upanishad, and it describes Om. So Om goes back to the Vedas. But in the Vedas, it's kind of more like an exclamation, like Om, like, yeah, like Om. It's like, Om, we're going to talk about this thing now. Bring it Om. But in the Mandukya Upanishad, they talk about the 4 parts of Om. Have you guys been to yoga class? And some teachers chant Om like Om, just Om, and then others chant it as Aum. Okay, we're going to clarify that for you right now. So Om is Om, as my teacher said. I asked him this question. I'm like, is Om 4 parts or is Om 1? He's like, Richie, Om is Om. It's like, that was not helpful. But in the Mandukya Upanishad, they divide Om into the A, the U, the and the silence. So the fourth part is actually the silence. And it's a metaphor for consciousness and for like waking, dreaming, sleeping, and then the void. Or beginning, sustaining, ending, and then the. So like, it's life. It's like the cycle of life and death. Something comes into being, something is sustained, something dissipates, and then there's that space before that arises again. So the 4 parts, the number 4 is considered sacred in Hinduism because it's like complete. Like a cow has 4 feet. That's a complete set. So and then the 4th, that's like a complete thing. 4 is like it's set. That's why your sutra book has 4 feet in it. 4 padas. Pada is literally foot. Isn't that cool? So it's like complete. So when you chant Om, it's just different traditions will either chant it as the singularity of sound, or they'll divide it into those 4 sounds, the 3 sounds and the silence, as a way of referencing back to this kind of idea of like beginning, middle, end. Yeah?
I've heard it go, Ari Om. What was this?
That's a chant.
Okay.
Hari, and then Om. So Hari, I'm actually not sure what Hari means, if it's just like praise or citations or God.
A different.
Yes.
Like
Hari Om, yeah. But it's Om. Om is Om. Hari is something else. Hari Om. Om, Om, Om. Yeah, does that make sense? So that's where the 4 parts come from. And so neither one is wrong. They're just different sides of the same Om, basically.
And when you say the 4 parts, it's
Ooh, and then I love that there's the silence.
Silence is
It just gives it such a
just
richness.
lineal feeling
Yeah.
at the end of it. It lets you digest it and it lets you quench your soul.
Did you hear that voice word in yesterday's class? Obviously you weren't here, but we did an Om, did we not, at the end of traditional? How powerful. There was some woman's voice. It was just unbelievable. It was crazy. Sorry, that was inside.
That word samsara,
Samsara.
is that literal when they say the cycle of death and rebirth? It's a beautiful word.
Samsara.
Is it literal?
I'm not sure.
Or is that a spiritual rebirthing, like a growth and evolution of humanness changing and
I don't know literally the translation, but samsara, it's the wheel of
Yeah, I really like that word.
suffering. Yeah, but I don't know what it's what it breaks down into. So, out of the traditions of renunciation, so out of these people going off into the forest and renouncing things, there were some other traditions which developed. Buddhism, which many of you have all of you probably have heard of Buddhism, and Jainism, which you may or may not have heard of. So this all comes from the same roots.
It's like
Did you say vagina?
vagina.
No, Jainism. Ladies and he's being very, the ladies, not vaginaism, Jainism. Jainism. There's a whole thing happening over here.
also that into the yoga, the history of how started it.
I don't know where they went. I don't know where they went. All right, bringing it back, everybody. We have thousands of years to cover here. Islands. So they actually, this is a Jain temple outside of Udaipur in India. And so they'll walk around with masks on so as to not inhale insects, and they'll sweep the ground. They would not kill the tick. There was a tick earlier. Okay, they would not kill any creature. So perfectly nonviolent. So what I want you to do right now, you can enter this into your handout or just have a little chat. How about groups of 3? Or, groups of 3s or 4. I want you to think about, how do you practice renunciation? So we still have a culture or a thread of renunciation even in our daily lives, even though we're not leaving society, leaving our husbands or cows or children. We do practice renunciation in some ways. So think about, how do you personally practice renouncing, and how does that serve you? What does it give you? Okay, off you go. So, I know, and this is just planting seeds, you guys. You can continue these chats too. But renunciation can be, I'm taking a technology fast. I'm not going to be on my phone. I'm not going to eat sugar.
Wine.
I'm not going to drink wine.
Why?
Right? There's lots of different, or I'm going to abstain from saying bad things about other people, whatever. There's ways to, or complaining. I'm not going to complain. So there's lots of ways that we do it. A lot of times, yogis love to do typically they're juice fasts and funny things like that. So, all right. So in other news at this time, King Tut in Egypt, the use of chairs, thanks Egypt. The Middle East, Moses and the 10 Commandments.
We sit on the floor.
Greeks capture Troy. The Aztec civilization flourishes in the Americas. So these are just some of the things that are happening. So that concludes kind of our Upanishads. Now, the thing about the Upanishads is that who can practice yoga? People who go into the woods, leave their wives, men, right, we're talking men. Upanishads mention some women, but mostly this is still male-driven. And so in this age, the epic stories, heroes in daily life, we see a shift. So up until this point in time, it's yoga can't be practiced by anyone unless you can afford to run off in the forest and just meditate the whole time. The epic age is characterized by 2 great epic stories called the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Has anyone heard of those? Mm-hmm. So they're great stories, huge soap operas, demons and gods and Hanuman, the monkey god. When you hear about Hanuman, or these great kind of eagles and like Garuda and like all of these sages and stuff like that, that's taken from like these huge epic stories. And so these are dramatic sweeping tales of like love and loss and fighting and friendship, and it's like crazy fun. So all of a sudden, embedded in one of these tales, particularly in the Mahabharata, which means the Great War, there is a story, a chapter which is called the Bhagavad-Gita. Maybe some of you may have heard of. And in the Bhagavad-Gita, let's lay it out. Okay, so in the Bhagavad-Gita, a great battle is about to happen. And our hero, Arjuna, who's a soldier, it's his duty, it's his dharma to be a soldier. He goes out onto the field of battle. He's with his chariot, he's got his charioteer, and he decides he's going to survey the battlefield. So he rides out onto the field of battle to look at the armies. And the thing is that this is a dynastic family war. So what's happened is that basically the other side of the family isn't giving up power, and they're supposed to. And so he goes out to look at the lines of battle, and he's got his army on one side, the army on the other side. He looks across and he's like, there is like my friend and my sword master. And he's looking across at these people that he's supposed to kill. And he goes, this is terrible. This is a terrible idea. I can't go out there. How will I kill my friends? How am I killing my cousins and my family? I can't do it. No good is going to come from this. And he lays down his sword. He's like, I can't fight. Arjuna is us. This is us. These are the people. It's like, how do I practice yoga? How do I lead a life with integrity that requires violence, that requires conflict, that requires going into battle, that requires the fray? Have you guys been in a tough situation in your life where you felt between a rock and a hard place? How do I make these decisions? How do I go forward when neither choice is good and requires harm to some extent?
It's an ethical dilemma.
It's an ethical dilemma. And this is where exactly where Arjuna is. And so Arjuna is us, dealing with daily life. Do I leave? Do I just leave the battlefield and I go off and I'm just going to sit and I'm going to meditate? I'm going to get out of the field, which is what he kind of wants to do. How do I stay and fight? And so, fortunately for Arjuna, his charioteer just happens to be Krishna, a god. Happily for him. So he turns to Krishna and he's like, Krishna, teach me. What can I do? And this is important. It's like we have to be open to learning. That moment where he says, teach me. I don't know what to do. Please help me. Like that's what we have you been to the lowest point, the lowest of the low, and you're like, I don't know what to do. I got to ask for help. But sometimes it's like getting to the bottom of the barrel before we're able to open ourselves to change, because it's too excruciating. Human condition. So he turns to Krishna, and Krishna is a metaphor for his higher self. Just like you have inside you a higher self that knows the path, even if we can't see it all the time. So he goes to Krishna and he says, what do I do? And Krishna's like, okay, let me teach you. I'll teach you. And so Krishna, basically the moral of Krishna's story is like to see from the highest. And he's very funny. First he's like, don't be such a girly man. Get up and fight. That's just, it's hilarious. And then he's like, don't you look out? Don't you see the higher point of view? Here's like, everyone gets reincarnated. You kill them, they'll come back. No big deal. It's like, but what he's really asking Arjuna to do is to take a higher perspective. Instead of looking at the problem as being right here in the moment, he's saying, step back and see the big picture. See your problem from the highest point of view. What's really the good choice? Because in the moment we get so human and caught up in our own feelings that we don't see the bigger spiritual picture of, that sometimes life involves suffering and things like that. But from the highest point of view, it's actually good. So in the tale of the Bhagavad-Gita, Krishna imparts 3 different pathways to Arjuna that he can follow. And one of the pathways that he follows is Nyana Yoga. Nyana Yoga.
Is that how you say that? The J-N?
Yes, Nyana. It's like a nya. Nya. Nya, nya, nya. Okay. Nya, nya, nya. Oh, and I do want to mention the word dharma. Because Arjuna's dharma is his lifely purpose, his duty. And we all have a dharma. Sometimes our dharma is trying to figure out what the heck our dharma is. Because we're like, I don't know what my life's purpose is. I'm trying to figure it out. Sometimes that's in the moment what we're actually doing. So the 3 kinds of yoga of the Bhagavad-Gita, Nyana Yoga, and this is the kind that we already know from the Upanishads. It's meditation. Like if I can meditate and get outside of the chaos of my mind, then I settle into a place which is of greater truth, in which I find that calmness and that stillness. This is like, when we do the Yoga Sutras, right? It's like yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind, because then I experience my true nature. That's what this is. Still the fluctuations of your mind, and experience what your true nature is, experience your higher self. So it's one path, so we already know that path. The second path is karma yoga, yoga of action. And in karma yoga, he says, hey, Arjuna, you can still do your dharma, still do your worldly actions. He's like, in fact, he's not gonna tell you, this is Krishna. He's like, even if you go into the forest, you're still breathing, you're still walking on the ground, you're still eating, you're still doing stuff. How are you not creating karma? Of course you're creating karma. We're always creating karma. Don't pretend you can't. Don't be silly. He says, but the trick is, don't get attached. Because if you get attached to the results of your actions, the fruits of your actions, that's when it starts to stick to you. That's when you start to carry it with you in your mind, right? You're like, I do this thing, and then afterwards you're like, oh, was that the right thing to do? I don't know, like, how did that go? Did they really like it? And then all of a sudden here we are in this like fray, right? Whereas if you do the thing and you do it and then it's gone, it's gone. You're done. You're not attached to the stickiness of it. But you do the best you can. It's not apathy. Show up, do your highest, do your best work, do what you can. It's like studying for a test. Study hard. Don't bail on the test. But then once you've given it your best effort, you let go of your attachment to how it goes. Because he says, look, you are responsible for your actions, but you're not responsible for the results. When you break up with someone, can you control how they feel? No. You break up with one person, they're delighted. They're like, yay, I've been meaning to do that for months. I just haven't had the guts. Thank you for finally pulling the plug on this. Okay. Wouldn't that be nice? Okay. Another person you break up with, they like want to kill you with an axe. You can't control how they feel. You can only control your actions, right? Though it's true, we cannot control. But we can act in our highest. We can act, and we can try to act in their highest interest too. We can try to do our best. So there's a story. There's an old monk and a young monk. And the old monk and the young monk are walking down to the river. And there at the river, at the foot of the river, there's this beautiful, hachi, delicious young woman. Oh my gosh. And she's like, can you please help me get across? Now they're not supposed to touch women or talk to them or anything like that. But the old monk is like, sure. So she climbs on top of the old monk. He carries her across the river. He puts her down. She runs away. Thank you. She runs off. The old monk and the young monk continue to walk for miles back to the monastery. Finally, the young monk can't contain himself anymore. He's like, how could you do it? How could you touch her? She climbed on top of you. She rode you across the river. We're not supposed to touch women, blah, blah, blah. And the old monk turns to him and goes, he's like, I put her down miles ago. Why are you still carrying her? Oh. Right. So it's like, do what you do and then let it go. Wow. All right. So bhakti yoga, the third kind of yoga. So karma yoga is do your duty, do your dharma, do your actions, and then let go of the fruits of your actions. You're not responsible for that.
Better be careful then.
Oh, yeah. So bhakti yoga, this is the third kind of yoga that Krishna imparts, is the yoga of love, the yoga of devotion. And Krishna kind of goes like, he's like, this is the best. He's like, this is the best kind. Just love me. Just worship me. He's like, even if you're worshiping another god, it's okay. That's still me. It's still me. It's all me. It's all me. I'm Krishna. I'm actually everything. I'm the Alpha. I'm the Omega. I'm everything. Everything is me. Krishna is everything. So worship that. And this actually became very, very popular. And this is a beautiful thing. Have you gone to kirtan? Ever chanting, stuff like that? Okay, so that's part of the bhakti yoga tradition. And it's basically like seeing love in everything. And what's beautiful about this is that Krishna's like, you don't have to give me something fancy. You don't have to give me hundreds of dollars. You find a flower and you offer that. You offer that in devotion with a pure heart. That's all you need. So not only is this opening up yoga for everybody, it's like yoga for poor people, yoga for women, yoga for children. All of a sudden you can practice yoga of devotion, or karma yoga. Anyone can practice that in their daily lives, still have a wife, still have a cow, still have a kid, participate in the cycle, the conflict, and practice yoga. And so it's kind of fun because there's the three different kinds of yoga. It's like Nyana yoga is kind of for like the head cases. Karma yoga is for the active people, and bhakti yoga is for the heart people. Right? So something for everybody. Now everybody can do yoga. So in a marked change from the yoga of the Upanishads, now yoga is for everybody, and it's your own practice. So no one has to, you don't need a priest, right? So Arjuna did go into battle and he won, by the way. End of story. Okay. So in other news, a lot is going on. This is like Rome becoming a republic, the rise and fall of Rome, geometry, Alexander the Great founds Alexandria, the trial and death of Socrates, Solomon builds the Jewish temple, the Old Testament is finished, the rise of Buddhism in Asia, foundation of Japan, in the Americas, the rise of the Mayan civilization. So lots happening in the world. Good? Epic stories. All right. The classical age. So when you study Patanjali, this is what this is. So basically now, the simmering crockpot of philosophy that is India has been churning on for a few thousand years. And so what's happened is that in our beautiful tree, there's been different branches of philosophy that have grown, and now they're sophisticated enough that they can like debate with each other and talk to each other. And these are called different viewpoints or darshanas. So there's a story of the elephant and the men, the blind men. So the villagers come to the blind men and they go, come and see this creature, we don't know what it is, or come and check it out. And they're like, okay. So they go over and they're touching it, and one of them is touching the side of the elephant, and he's like, it's a wall. And then someone is touching the tusk, and he's like, it's a sword. And someone is touching the tail, and he's like, it's a broom. So they all have, someone's hugging the leg, it's a tree. So these are like the different viewpoints, the philosophical viewpoints in India, where all of them are pointing at a complete truth, just nobody has the full story. Right? So it's kind of like the elephant is the source or the ultimate reality, and these different viewpoints are ways or access points to that, which all have a slightly different take. And this is kind of why India is so cool, is because these different, like there's a tradition in India of like you would go and debate someone, and then the loser, it wasn't like a loser, you had to go study with the other person. It's like you lost, you have to come and study my point of view then. So there's this kind of wonderful bandying around of ideas. But now we're at a point in time where it's less, in earlier periods of time we were like channeling wisdom, and it was like intuitive insight, smoking joints in the forest like the hippies without the sex, and stuff. And now we're at a point where things are becoming a little bit more like philosophy and studied and ideas, and like, I can think of like the Greeks, like, so plebeius, what think you of this Socratic dialogue? It's more like that. So when you study the Yoga Sutras, and the first sutra says, Hatha Yoga Nushasanam. Now the Exposition of Yoga. Now it's like them presenting their school in a way. One element of that is like, now we're going to talk about the real yoga. Okay, everybody. It's like the beginning of a thesis. So this is the time that we're entering now. Hello. Hello, hello. God bless you. Namaste. She brought me.
Red Beard did not know what I was talking about. He's like, is that Starbucks speak? And I'm like, this is what she ordered. Just take it. He's like, okay. So
That's perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. It's great. It's coffee. It's coffee. Okay. So these are the 6 orthodox schools of this time. So different schools, right? And one of them you see is yoga. So here's where we are. Now, orthodox just means that they trace their origins back to the Vedas. That's all that means. That they cite the Vedas as their source material for these different schools. So Samkhya and yoga are very, very similar, and then there's a whole bunch of them, right? So this is where we're placed, but yoga is one of them, and yoga is about practice. So some scholars actually make little distinction between Samkhya and yoga, because they're really like, Samkhya is kind of like the philosophical sister school, and yoga is kind of like the practice school. So in yoga, we tend to do practices, usually meditation practices, in order to understand it, whereas Samkhya is more about understanding the framework of what it is. And we'll talk a little bit about Samkhya just to, it's not, don't get too stressed out about Samkhya, but it's actually really cool to understand it, because it's what philosophy, it's like the underpinnings of the yoga practice. It gives the philosophical understanding to why we do what we do. So the non-Orthodox schools, those just mean that they don't trace their origins to the Vedas. So yoga does trace back to the Vedas, but Buddhism doesn't, Jainism doesn't. Carvaka, which is, I don't know what it is, doesn't. But they're their own schools of thought. So Samkhya philosophy, remember how we talked about dual and non-dual? So something that's non-dual, all is one. Dual, things are separate, basically. So the classical, and I use classical loosely, school of yoga, which is represented by Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, so this is what you're studying, is dual. Okay? That doesn't mean you have to believe in dual. And don't worry, there's other schools later which are non-dual, but they're dual. There's Purusha, consciousness, and there's Prakriti, mama nature. And those things are different. So all of this stuff that you can touch and feel and is of the body and of your senses, that is perceivable by the senses, things that you can smell, taste, touch, hear, all of that stuff is part of this material world, Prakriti. Prakriti like mama nature. Your soul, consciousness, ultimate reality is separate from that. But through meditation, you have an experience of it, right? You remember the metaphor of the lake and the sky, and then when like the lake is consciousness and the vritti and stuff like that, but ultimate reality is somewhere else. But we can experience it when we calm our mind. It's kind of the idea behind meditation. So the gunas, Prakriti, Mother Nature, is governed by three kind of qualities of nature called the gunas: Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. Rajas is basically everything speeding up, crazy. Tamas is everything inertia, slowing down. And Sattva is like the luminosity or the balance between the two, or the absence of the other two. It just kind of explains why everything is always moving in Prakriti, right? Can you think of anything in the world of Prakriti that isn't changing? Coffee is very rajasic, it's very speedy. Can you think of anything that doesn't change?
Air?
Air moves.
Air quality changes.
Everything changes, right? So if it changes, it's part of Prakriti. If it doesn't change, it's part of Purusha consciousness. So those qualities just kind of explain why everything is moving or how it's moving, right? It's always things are always speeding up, slowing down, or kind of in the middle, basically. So Samkhya. Now, this looks like a crazy town, but don't get too freaked out about it. Purusha over there is the universal soul, and we all have our little bits. We all have our little bits of universal soul, which connects to the big universal soul. Prakriti is mama nature. And then basically this is the map. So Samkhya is a big map to describe how we understand the world. So as a human being, in a nutshell, we take in information through our five senses, right? So the world, here are the gross elements of the world: earth, air, fire, water, ether. And we perceive all of those things. So we take it in through our senses, the portals of our senses. And through that we filter it through our consciousness, our sense of ego, right? So Rachel, I take in, I'm like, here I am in a room, or here I am, I feel something hard and firm, it's on the floor, right? I'm taking this in, and I have an understanding of what this is. And then I filter it through me. I'm like, I feel, I have a personality, and I feel the floor. And then I might filter it through all my memories of what things are, you know? And remember that, oh, I've had an experience of this before, and we called it floor, right? But ultimately, the ultimate reality, like that filters all through the higher mind, and then this is all the world of Prakriti. So it's all the world of me perceiving things and having a mind and like making decisions and determining things, which is separate from my soul, which is the silence of all of that when I can experience it. So they were very nerdy, basically. They were nerdy, and they mapped everything out. So, and this is what the idea that there is a soul and that there is a world of moving, living, breathing things that is not the soul is basically the foundation for the yoga practices of Patanjali, where we say, hey, in order to get out of this chaos, we need to still the mind. So we need to calm all of that stuff down. We need to withdraw the senses. We need to go inside and stop being so focused on all this moving stuff so that we can experience Purusha, which is actually what the true universal soul is. So this kind of map is underlying meditation practices. So the yoga of Patanjali is basically a compilation of all this meditation about 200 CE, and I say about because we don't know for sure. Sutra means thread. So you know how you have Hatha Yoga Nushasanam or Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha? These little threads, these little short sayings, but then we're the ones who pull them together into a tapestry, right? It's a short little saying. So they were memorizing these things. So if they could say a short little thing, and then that would mean something, it would be a bigger discussion, just like you guys have bigger discussions about these sutras. So the Yoga of Patanjali includes the 8 limbs, which is called Ashtanga Yoga, not to be confused with Patabi Joyce Vinyasa Ashtanga Yoga. You'll get to it in your book when you study it, but it has to do with the yamas and the niyams, ahimsa, satya, some of these precepts that yogis live by. You'll dig in more into that later. Yoga's chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind stuff. This summarizes, this is the whole thesis statement for Patanjali. If we could just get it after reading that, we wouldn't need the whole book. You know, yoga is the restraint of the fluctuations of the mind. That's enlightenment, that's samadhi. And you'd be like, awesome, got it. But unfortunately, we're like, oh, and then your mind goes somewhere else, right? So that's why he gives you a whole book of like practices and descriptions and stuff like that to help us out. This is a little graphic of the 8 limbs: yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. So you can see asana. Oh, see, we recognize that word. Asana, seat, it means posture. And then pranayama, breath control. So some of these things which we recognize here, we see threads to what we do today, right? But keep in mind that until this time, yoga is all about meditation. It's not about doing tree pose. Everybody, the asana that they're talking about is a meditation seat, to sit in yourself. All right, so you guys will investigate more of that as you do the sutras. So in other news, classical yoga, the Pantheon got built. Hadrian's Wall, if anyone's seen that, in England, was built by the Romans. There were lots of Roman emperors, the fall of Rome. Jesus was around. The Saxons and the Anglos invaded Britain. Tea drinking became common in China. The Great Wall of China started to be built. Chichen Itza was founded, that big Mayan city, and King Herod builds the Wailing Wall. So that's kind of what's going on. All right, how are your brains? Full of stories?
Yeah.
No. Why don't we take let's take like a 2-minute break. Pee break if you need to, shake it off, stretch a little bit. Now just remember, don't panic about remembering every detail. Today is more about getting the big flow of ideas and taking it in kind of like a story, right? So if you're like, oh my God, take a deep breath, let it go. Whatever you need to remember, you will remember. Whatever you don't remember and need to remember will be repeated. Let's summarize where we are so far. So in the beginning was the Indus Valley civilization. So Indus Valley civilization along rivers. Out of that arose the Vedas, which were hymns that were channeled to maintain the natural order of things and everything like that and keep everything running smoothly. But then the priests became more and more important. Everything became more and more hierarchical. Okay, and then we have the Upanishads, people going into the woods, doing Soma, channeling like insights and meditating. So then we have a movement from the external rituals of the Vedas to the internal ritual and meditations of the Upanishads. But then you're like, no one can practice yoga. So out of this, the epic stories came about. And in the epic stories, all of a sudden we see that we can practice and be in the world and practice yoga at the same time, either through a practice of letting go of our actions, karma yoga, or through an expression of devotion. So every act is a devotion to God and to the highest. So all of a sudden I can be a householder, have a cow, have a wife, have kids, have a fight, and I can still be practicing my yoga, still be living my dharma. So I can have a spiritual practice in the world. And then finally, the last piece that we looked at was the classical period, which is when all these philosophies become sophisticated enough, basically, to have their own school of thought. And represented by the yoga school is Patanjali, which is basically like meditation. Meditation, but with the viewpoint that I am separate from ultimate reality, but I can find it if I meditate hard enough. Right? So that's kind of where we've come so far. Make sense? So far so good? Ish? Okay, so now let all that trickle out of your mind. So as we got up, we just got up and stretched, and we were like, oh, the body, oh, that feels good. So one of the limitations of Patanjali's meditation stuff, so Patanjali was like the extreme dude of meditation, okay? And he is like, so in his style of yoga, all of this stuff is nonsense. It's not the real stuff, right? This is the stuff, we want to get past this in order to get to the real stuff, right? And so that's about to change with the rise of Tantra. So Tantra was like, you know what? This yoga stuff, the Samkhya stuff, that's really cool, but it's not the whole story. And their viewpoint is that if you could actually see things from the highest perspective, we would realize that everything is one, right? Now, that's a little misleading. There are lots of different tantric schools, and they're very complex too. But in a nutshell, they said, hey, the world, this isn't separate from awesomeness. The world is the same side of, it's like the opposite side of the coin as divinity. They're the same thing. So, like, it's not about getting rid of Mother Nature and getting rid of Prakriti and like getting rid of the body. Actually, the body is a manifestation of divinity itself. So, which I personally think is really lovely. Because in Patanjali's world, if we took that to the extreme, and there are yogis who do this, you would have the yogi who stood there, and in order to express his discipline and his disregard for material stuff, would hold his arm up like this for like 40 years, so that it became black and decayed, as an expression of his devotion to the highest reality and a disregard for this reality. Tantra, they wouldn't do that. They'd be like, don't do that, man. Like, this is like beautiful. This is part of the expression of divine too. Like, don't mess with that. So with Tantra, all of a sudden it became more of a world affirming practice, where the world around us and within us becomes actually a pathway to enlightenment, rather than discarding the body to get to the good stuff. This is the good stuff, and this is a pathway to the good stuff. So Tantra opened the door. It was a revolution in thought that opened the door to more body-based practices. So even though, if you remember back in the Upanishads had recognized that there were different layers of experience, like there was the food body, the material body, and the subtle body, and the mind. They recognized that there was an inner experience. Tantra took that and went off the hook. They like went inside and they're like, there are chakras and there are nadis and there's all these subtle body energies. And so all of a sudden they became very curious about what the body was telling them, and like what the inner experience of that was. And that those, understanding those different sensations and feelings and energies in the body could actually be a pathway to meditation. So this opened up the doorway to using a whole bunch of different stuff to meditate and to experience ultimate reality. Now, the reason we got some goddesses up here is because, do you guys remember we had Prakriti and Purusha? Those things were separate. And Prakriti is Mother Nature. And so Prakriti is like Mother Nature is the world of the stuff that's manifest, right? So before we were kind of disregarding that, like, ugh, that's the stuff to throw out to get to this other stuff. But in Tantra, they're like, no, this is good stuff. So it's represented by the feminine. So Purusha, consciousness, is represented by the masculine, whereas Prakriti, Mother Nature, even we say Mother Nature, is represented by the feminine, that which can give birth and create things, right? So that's why goddess worship sort of came back to life, because people wanted to revere the energy of of the creation, of manifestation, and the goddesses do that. So that's why I started worshiping the ladies. So now all of a sudden samsara, this wheel of suffering, remember that, samsara? All of a sudden that's nirvana. It's the same thing. This wheel that we're in is actually the pathway towards liberation, which I like. I'd much rather not throw the world away. I'd much rather think of myself as a manifestation of the divine in a human living form, and that this is all good. And it also creates a worldview which is very world positive. All of a sudden it matters how we take care of the world, because the world is an expression of divine. It's not like I need to get rid of it. So all of a sudden it matters if, how we live, or how climate change is, or I want to take care of this because this is an expression of the highest too. So things like using mantra, like sound, and using yantra, visualizations, can happen. And so Tantra opened the door for Hatha Yoga, which is more of the postural-based yoga and body-based practices. So they're still meditating, but they're meditating on like more subtle aspects of the self. And they're using their bodies as a way to experience things that are more divine. And of course, tantric teachings were really interesting. The reason you might be wondering, why have I heard of tantric sex? How does that play into all of this stuff? I don't know if you were thinking that or not. I was just thinking that. Well, Dee was thinking. Okay. So here's the deal, is that in the ascetic yoga, the renouncing yoga, it was like, get rid of all the temptations, right? Get rid of the material world, get rid of your wine, don't eat meat, get rid of women, get rid of like, all of that body-based stuff is nonsense, get rid of it. In Tantra, because the world is an expression of divinity, nothing in it can be inherently bad, because it's all God. From the highest perspective. This doesn't mean if your neighbor shoots your dog, you're not going to be mad. But from the highest perspective, all of that is an expression of this divine creation. So, because everything is God, nothing is forbidden. So it wasn't like they ran off and had orgies, but they would have rituals, maybe like highly ritualized and probably not very sexy, sexual practices, like what we call the left-handed practices, like the most extreme versions of Tantra. This was not mainstream. But people who took it to the nth degree would do things like eat small bits of meat, consume small bits of alcohol, have ritualized sex as a way of dismantling the forbidden aspects of things. Right. So that's where that's where Tantra got its tantric sex, kind of westernized sort of thing, right? Because Westerners were feeling very repressed and needed a portal to think sex was okay after the 50s. All right. So the Tantra opened up all these new practices. Here's a little picture of the chakras, right? So after this, the understanding and the mapping of the inner body became much more elaborate and sophisticated. And the use of mantra became very sophisticated too. So that's like where Tantra happened. So in other news, medieval Europe in the Dark Ages. Oh, bummer. the killing of heretics. Oh, the Crusades. Yeah, plagues. Genghis Khan. Oh, but Rumi, Persian mystic poet Rumi. That's nice. That's a nice thing. Muhammad was born. The Quran was written. So. In Europe we just won't talk about Europe. Okay, so then that brings us to Hatha Yoga. Hatha Yoga. And notice we're like in the Middle Ages now, okay? So Tantric philosophy opened the door for a fuller expression of using the body to achieve liberation. And so Hatha Yoga encompasses all the practices that, all the yoga practices that we think of. It's like, asana and pranayama and meditation. Like we right now in our culture, we have Hatha as a certain style of yoga. But this is like big Hatha. This is the umbrella Hatha. Hatha Yoga is actually a huge umbrella for all of those practices. It's just someone in the Western took it on as a branding thing and called a certain style Hatha, but everything's Hatha Yoga. Everything's Hatha. So the word Hatha is interesting because it's an umbrella term for the physical yoga practices that we know. But Hatha literally means forceful. So there's a play on words where it means sun, moon, but Hatha means forceful. It's not like chill out, relax. It's like we're going to fire you up for transformation. So Hatha Yoga has its roots in alchemy. So do you guys know, like, I'm going to make lead into gold thing? It's alchemy, like through these processes. Well, people were literally trying to do that and eating weird stuff and like mercury and trying to make that happen. And so there was this idea of that was first like a literal thing, like transmute lead into gold. That became more symbolic. Like, how can I make this body, which is imperfect and impure and kind of like maybe dull? Some days after you've had like a big hamburger or like had a bunch of wine or whatever and you feel like, bleh, right, gross. And then other times you've just done a juice cleanse or you've eaten really well for, 3 weeks and you feel like bright and alive and lively, right? So kind of in the same way, Hatha was like, how can I change this body to be a fit vessel for transformation? Like, how can I purify this body? How can I change this body from lead to gold so it can withstand the tremendous forces of transformation? Because this is true too if you've experienced your energy body, which maybe some of you have and maybe some of you are kind of like playing around with. But when you meditate, you can feel your energy, but you have to get really subtle about it. And if you're busy digesting a hamburger, you're not going to be able to feel that because all you're thinking about is I just ate a hamburger, or I feel nauseous because I just, had wine or ate too many potato chips or whatever. You're not going to be able to have the subtle refinement of experience to feel like, how is prana moving in my body? How do I feel energy and breath in my body? And if we get our bodies into a state that is clean and clear enough, then we can become more sensitive to those sensations. We're not busy digesting or whatever. So part of this is an alchemist, is part of this is about how do I refine myself so that I can experience those energies and elevate my experience of myself. So this is still about finding, even though we're doing now more physical-based practices, it's still about finding the source inside and being a source to ourselves. And they're just saying like, you know what, it helps if, you've done some clean living and do these practices to help your body be in a state to experience those things, to feel it. So the Hatha Yoga Pradipika is one of the texts. There's several texts, but this is one of the texts. And it describes things which we would recognize, Like there's, I think, 16 asana in it. Now, many of them are meditation postures, but they're also very interested in digestion. So we're talking about, yoga and health, right? They were very interested in digestion and saw that as like key to health and longevity. 16 asana, a bunch of pranayama techniques, you guys, like alternate nostril breathing, Kapalabhati. They talk a lot about like the bandhas and mudras. So all of those things that we kind of associate with some of the yoga tools and practices that we use, we can find in Hatha Yoga. This is where they started to really use the body and the shape of the body and these internal locks as a way of practicing their yoga. It was still for the point of meditation though. You knows that. They were just like, we're going to prepare the body so it's fit to meditate. Because people get squirrely and twitchy, right? And you can't sit and meditate if your knees hurt or you're thinking about your bum shoulder. So like, how can we prepare the body to be able to do these things? So Pattabhi Jois, who created Ashtanga Yoga, if any of you have heard of him, he said Hatha Yoga is experiencing God inside. So it's just interesting for us to remember as teachers who are teaching primarily a physical practice that even here in Hatha Yoga, the purpose of it is to experience an intimacy with our highest self or the highest inside, even though it might look like a bunch of pranayama techniques or asana techniques. In other news, Christopher Columbus and the discovery of the New World, migration of Europe, scientific, the humanist revolution, thank goodness we get out of the Dark Ages in Europe, Baroque and classical eras, Shakespeare, which is great, and a lot of bad news in North and South America because of the arrival of the Europeans. So, any questions about Hatha Yoga or Tantra? We're almost there. We're here. This is our last era, everybody. This is it. We made it to our branch of the tree. Vedas, Upanishads, Bhagavad-Gita, classical yoga, Tantra, and now we're at modern yoga. Here we are. So this is modern living day yoga. So this is when yoga comes to North America. So in 1893, at the first Parliament of World Religions, Swami Vivekananda, who was actually a Vedanta yogi, he was a different school than yoga, but he was Vedanta philosophy, came over and spoke, and people were like, oh my God, it's so amazing, it's so cool. They became fascinated by this. So he lectured all over, and so now we started to have an exchange of ideas across the continents, which is exciting. Now, Krishnamacharya was a teacher, a very influential teacher for our purposes, living in India. He was a yoga teacher, and he was a scholar. Like, he knows all of the different viewpoints, schools, a great philosopher. Siri, I'm not talking to you. And so he was the father, the teacher to Iyengar, Pattabhi Jois, and Desikachar and Indra Devi. So we're going to talk about those four people, but they were very influential in taking the ideas of yoga and bringing them to Europe and into North America. So he's kind of like our granddaddy in a way. If we have to trace our lineage and what you're learning in here back, you would trace it to Krishnamacharya. And he was pretty wild. He was born in 1888. So Pattabhi Jois, we're just going to look at the three students. He had lots of students, but these are the ones that affected North American yoga the most. Pattabhi Jois studied with Krishnamacharya as a young man, and he was given the Ashtanga yoga series to teach. So have any of you guys practiced Ashtanga? It's a set series you have. It's hard. It's lots of sun salutations. It's where we get sun salutations, and power yoga and vinyasa yoga is from Ashtanga. Right? So it's a set series of postures and stuff like that you do. It's a challenging practice. And some of the things that are included in Ashtanga, which we practice, is stuff like Ujjayi Pranayama, the use of drishti, gaze, the use of bandha, like engaging the pelvic floor and these kind of inner locks to help harness the physical body. Sun salutations. Movement as meditation. One of his other students was Iyengar, who many of you may have heard of. Now, Iyengar was very sickly as a child and he was, I think, the brother-in-law to Krishnamacharya. And so he taught lots of Westerners, and he discovered that using props, blocks, straps, bolsters, whatever, walls, whatever he could get his hands on, helped him to get people into alignment. And so for him, it was like you get the physical body into alignment, and then the other pieces, the mental alignment, the emotional alignment, the spiritual alignment arises from that. So he's the reason that we have props and yoga walls and straps and things like that, this guy. And he wrote some great, amazing books like Light on Yoga, Light on Life. He's amazing. He's written so much, and he's a great, great resource. Impeccable alignment. Pranayama in his style is practiced outside of the yoga practice. So you do your asana and then you do pranayama later. So, but he's been incredibly influential in Western yoga. Desikachar, he's his son, Krishnamacharya's son, and studied with him later when Krishnamacharya was more mellow. And so it's more like breath-centered practice. So if you've heard of Leslie Kaminoff or Gary Krafsow or these yoga therapeutic practices that start with the breath, that's this lineage. So this is where we get that kind of stuff. Mark Whitwell is another guy. So the breath is the source with Desikachar. And then Indra Devi, she got to study with Krishnamacharya. She came over and he was like, no, you're a girl. And then she was such a good student and so disciplined and determined that he was like, all right, yes. And so she took yoga back to Hollywood and popularized yoga here. So his 4 students have really been enormously influential in popularizing and bringing these ideas of yoga to the North American mainstream. So what next? So many of the yoga styles that we practice, vinyasa, hatha, power, flow, all of these things, Baptiste, these teachers, David Swenson, Shiva Ray, Sean Korn, John Friend, Leslie Kaminoff, Anna Forrest, Gary Krafsow, like these are all different styles of yoga that all kind of come from these roots. There are a couple that don't, like hot yoga and kundalini are not from the Krishnamacharya lineage, but a lot of what we see in yoga classes today really are influenced by this.
A question about hot yoga.
Yes.
First of all, is there, like, why is it hot? Is it to increase our physical capabilities, or is it more about aligning our mental with our physical?
Both.
Okay.
So hot yoga has some benefits in terms of its ability to increase flexibility, blood flow, things like that. Heat is actually creates heat shock proteins, good for body and longevity, interestingly enough. But then mentally, really, I think the purpose of the hot yoga practice is to make you kind of freak out, right? So there's something called tapas, which means heat or intensity. And tapas is the willingness to endure intensity for the sake of transformation. So the hot yoga practice becomes an opportunity to adhere ourselves to the present moment in the midst of a challenge and to question the stories of our mind. So I think hot yoga is incredibly powerful as a mind control practice. And we'll discover how breath has been, and pranayama, and how it shows up in your yoga practice is really important for actually controlling your nervous system. So, cool. Right, so now you guys get to decide. It's like, how are you going to be part, now that you have a sense of what your tree branch is, how do you want to be part of this ongoing living tradition and bringing the roots of yoga forward in your practice, in your intentions, and also in your teaching?